Mr. Amash is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gowdy. I have a question for Dr. Gruber concerning tax credits. Dr. Gruber, at a conference in 2012, you said, quote, if you're a state and you don't set up an exchange, that means your citizens don't get their tax credits, end quote. That statement was consistent with other public statements you made, all of which expressed your belief that if a state refused to set up an Obamacare exchange, the citizens of that state could not qualify for Obamacare tax credits. Yet the administration has ordered the distribution of billions of dollars to persons who live in states that don't have state-run Obamacare exchanges. This executive action seems to conflict with your numerous past statements about how Obamacare works. There's a lawsuit before the Supreme Court on this issue. In your testimony this morning, you claimed that you misspoke repeatedly in your prior public statements. You say that, quote, the point I believe I was making was about the possibility that the federal government, for whatever reason, might not create a federal exchange, end quote. You further explained this morning in response to Mr. Connolly's question that you think the administration can choose whether or not to create federal exchanges in states that refuse to set up those exchanges. So if a state refuses to set up an Obamacare exchange and the federal government refuses to set up an Obamacare exchange, then citizens of that state can't receive Obamacare tax credits. Dr. Gruber, your new explanation of your previous public statements makes little sense. The law requires the federal government to create Obamacare exchanges in states that refuse to create the exchanges for themselves. Therefore, every state must have an Obamacare exchange, either set up by the state or the federal government. If that's the case, that every state must have an Obamacare exchange, what did you mean when you repeatedly said that the citizens of some states may not qualify for Obamacare tax credits? Isn't it the case, as you said previously, that people who live in states without a state-run exchange cannot receive Obamacare tax credits?
Once again, when I made those comments, I believe what I was saying was reflecting uncertainty about the implementation of a federal exchange by January 1st, 2014.
Are you suggesting that the law doesn't require the federal government to set up an exchange in states that don't have exchanges?
I don't recall exactly what the law says. What I'm saying is there was certainly...
I'm sorry, you ran the economic model on Obamacare and you don't know what the law says?
In every single economic model I ran, I always assumed that credits would be available regardless of whether the exchange is run by a state or the federal government. My comments in January 2012 were reflecting the uncertainty about whether those federal exchanges might be ready by January 2014.
So you were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to run an economic model on Obamacare, and yet you were making statements that didn't reflect the actual language of Obamacare?
I made a series of statements which were really just inexcusable.
All right, thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand. We famously heard that you have to pass it to find out what's in it. So following up on Mr. Amash, at the time of its passage, were you aware that the language would have allowed your model not to actually be executed? In other words, that states were not going, if they chose not to, if even one state chose not to provide, the language explicitly was preventing that reimbursement, and thus you'd have a different result. Were you ever given that information so you could run a revised model?
I was always modeling the availability of tax credits under the assumption they'd be available in all states.
Okay, so you always modeled something that was different than the law.